Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and today I'm talking about the sapient state. Now, what is the sapient state? Well, I'm going to get to that. But before that, or to more accurately, to bring to you an understanding of my reasoning that leads to my conclusion regarding the sapient state, I'd like to present to you three contrasts representing four periods or four uh, degrees of sophistication of government that can be seen historically, barring the last one, which I propose is the new sapient state, which I propose, as far as I'm aware, does not exist, but that I believe is theoretically possible to produce. Now, what is the sapient state? Essentially, the sapient state is a government that is a computer. Now, that being said, I'm not talking about an electronic computer, but rather I am talking about the idea of a government that is organized in a way that it behaves as a computer and therefore produces a type of artificial intelligence that is not stored in any particular uh, memory drive, but exists rather as a result of the actions of members in a society and in a government as regulated by a system of laws. Now, where do I come to this? Well, I'd like to give you a little perspective on history here. So, the earliest phase of government that I would describe as developmental, as a development, is government as natural. Now, what does that mean? That means the way that government develops in its original form out of the natural relationships of human beings. And what is the natural relationship that I'm talking about? And that natural relationship is the family structure. That is to say, the dominance of parents over children develops into a type of government in absence of other forms of government and also persists. And I'd like to point out that the different forms of government here don't simply cease to exist in a progressive manner by the development of the new forms, but rather they fall underneath a superstructure of new forms of government in the sense that the development of more sophisticated societies does not lead automatically to the destruction of the family structure and the structures of authority within a family. Now, that being said, the way a family is structured or exactly how the authority operates can be altered through various forms of government. I'm not denying that, but what I am saying is that families don't cease to exist once a more sophisticated state arises. So this family structure can be described as there's obviously the idea of a nuclear family, but if you extrapolate that over generations, you end up producing clans and small tribes, and eventually you reach a point where the natural relationships are no longer able to maintain the structure of a society. You're no longer able to maintain political cohesion through the natural action of patriarchs or matriarchs or some other type of familial authority. And this is where a couple of things can happen. So there's a couple of different solutions to this problem. because this is a problem of the inability of a single person to manage a government. As society grows larger, the inability of a single person to act as a ruler in a society. And the way this resolves itself is in one of two ways. One way, which can be seen in various, historically, that is, in various tribes and among the Bantu populations of southern Africa, cattle herding tribes, where once the tribe grows to a certain size, it automatically splits, or the tribes are automatically divided between the sons of the leader, and they split up and they move into different lands and therefore hold their own territory where they can have their cattle graze. And therefore, there's no requirement for increased sophistication, because the problem of the difficulty of managing that society is resolved by simply dividing the society into smaller societies. And that's one way to solve a problem. The other way is to develop a more sophisticated system of government. And this, of course, leads to the first contrast here. And this contrast is the contrast between government as natural and government as artificial. Because in order to develop beyond the familial structure and the ability of a familial structure to manage a government, you have to essentially remove the natural element of government, or more accurately, replace it with something that can more effectively manage a larger number of people. And that is when government ceases to be natural and becomes artificial. And this artificiality is exemplified in the idea of a more sophisticated social hierarchy and the development of increased specialization, which also leads to the development of a more sophisticated intellectual culture and a more sophisticated material culture, historically speaking. And so you change over from the nomadic tribal societies to the developing kingdoms, kingdoms that are ruled by absolute monarchs in the early phase of the Bronze Age, wherein societies were controlled in an almost totalitarian manner, where food was rationed, walls were built to keep people from leaving the country. There was strict religious control. Control of the irrigation channels allowed for a strong control over the food supply of the population. And so early agrarian societies very frequently were very authoritarian, very totalitarian in the way that they operated. Now, of course, that changed over time as they developed more sophisticated material cultures that were able to increase the prosperity of the general population to some degree. But what is typical here is that you don't have a single person leading this society. You might have a single person at the top, but you have other people involved in the governance as perhaps administrators of some sort, perhaps as priests in a religious fashion, and perhaps you see the beginning of a more privatized economic system, not necessarily fully privatized, but more decentralized economics. Because in a family, the economic status of the government of a family is very unified and is very centralized. And when that changes to a larger society, that becomes less efficient, and therefore it's important for other individuals other than the leader to start acting as economic agents in a society, leading to a more developed economy and an economy that relies more on multiple types of expertise in order to meet demands. So, in that sense, government ceases to follow the natural familial structure and becomes artificial through a system of intermediate leaders and specialization. Now, that being said, this isn't full-on bureaucracy at this point quite yet. Now, the next difficulty here is the government as personal as opposed to the government as a corporation. Because in these early societies, the government was essentially not treated as a corporation, even though you could say that informally speaking, you could consider it to be developing towards a type of corporate model. But the government was the king or whoever was in charge. And that was the understanding of the government. There was no idea of a state that was not the same as the person of the ruler. And this meant that the government had to strongly rely on the personality of its rulers and had to strongly rely on the personality of its leadership and had to rely on a system that was based on the personal wealth of its leaders rather than a separate pool of wealth that was dedicated toward government activities. In that sense, the government is the property, that is, the state is the property of the ruler rather than the ruler being an officer in the state. And this change that developed later on, where rulers, rather than being seen as proprietors or as or in a more democratic system, the whole society might be seen as co-proprietors of the state. Instead, the state being considered as a distinct corporation, in my view, is an important development. A development both structurally and philosophically in a realistic sense, because it allows for the government to act as more than itself in the person of its rulers. That is to say, the government, once it is a corporation, can behave as more than the sum of its parts. Because although the rulers of a government in a corporate type government might consider the government to be their property and the government to work toward their own benefit, the government, functionally speaking, is operated in a way that also seeks to have a good for the state. And when I say the state, I mean the actual corporation of a government. I don't mean the people, okay? Although the people could also be a side benefit in a similar way that the ruler could be a side benefit. And this is what exists currently. And this is characterized by the development of more sophisticated bureaucracy, by the development of systems of laws that persist independently of rulers, the development of a government wherein the idea of corporations and properties is developed to a sophisticated degree to allow for a more complex type of economic interaction. But I think that this current state that the government is in, that is the phase of states as we have it today, in my view, is not the logically final state. And that being said, I'm not saying that there will be a final state. I'm not saying that there is a progression, but I am saying that the way that a government works can be seen in a similar way. That is, if you consider government as a corporation, you can consider the government to also be similar to a computational machine. That is, the government being artificial, the government being a corporation, the government is also a machine. And this machine, depending on the input and the way that that input is processed, can give you certain types of output. And that's why it's very important for people when they're designing a system of government to be very specific on certain issues, because that allows the system of government to function in a way that is balanced toward its needs as a government. But in this phase, the government is only an instrument. Okay, it is an instrument towards the ends of various people, but from a realistic, from a realist school of international relations, a state seeks to survive. But the survival of a state under this type of corporate government is a survival that is determined by the character of its rulership, by the character of its governors. And I posit that this is actually not as effective as it could be. And what I mean by that is, for example, in a democratic system, for example, the United States, the government is organized in a way that the people who get into power in order to actualize the government are people that require either an insider position in a certain community when we're talking about the executive departments, or if we're talking about elected positions, they have to win a popularity contest. And in order to win a popularity contest from millions of people, the popularity is determined largely, and this is seen in statistics, it's determined largely by amount of money spent. And that means that a large-scale democracy naturally will develop into a plutocracy as its population increases. And that is to say that if we consider the government as a computer and its laws as programming, then the programming of this computer is a programming that leads to malfunctions, a programming that leads to errors in the system, and errors in the system impede the function of government. And what is the function of government? Well, ultimately, the function of government is the establishment of justice. And justice can be defined in a number of different ways. I say that justice is defined based on who holds the power. in a particular system. So that is to say, someone might have particular goals, and these goals are then, by means of the power of the state, established as a system of justice and as a legal system, as laws that then effectuate this. However, I think that the selection process of leaders, as I have discussed in regards to the development of democracy into plutocracy, can be very important in determining the quality of the components of the computer. Because, as I said, the government as a corporation is a machine and is a computer, but the components of this computer are human beings and the laws, and the laws are only as effective as people enforce them. So, therefore, in order to develop a better government, it is important to develop a legal system that has fail-safes that ensure that if laws are not enforced, that somebody is punished and that those laws then are enforced. Otherwise, you end up in a situation wherein the law decays and the government decays, and just like the old tribes that got too large, they split up. The same thing happens to other governments as they exceed their capacity to govern their population. Now, that being said, the final conflict, therefore, is government as instrumental versus government as autothelemic. And what do I mean by autothelemic? Well, if by instrumental I mean that the government is an instrument of its corporate overlords, autothelemic means that the government has its own thelema. That is to say, it has its own will. And I'm not talking about the thelemic cult. I'm using the ancient Greek term thelema. It's used in a number of philosophical, theological disputes. There was a famous ecumenical council that was discussing the thelema of Jesus. But anyway, getting back on track, the thelema is the will, and an autothelemic government is a government that has its own will. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean that it's emotional. I don't mean that it wants to do frivolous things, that it has weird needs. I don't mean that the government becomes a person. I don't mean that the government becomes sentient. Okay? All I mean is that the government, from a realistic perspective, as I mentioned before, under the realistic idea of international relations, government has certain needs, and an autothelemic government is a government that actualizes these needs by its very structure, and the needs of a government are maintained computationally by the laws that structure the government and that structure how people that manage the government get into government to manage the government, and how they're held accountable when they are managing the government. And that leads to a government that no longer, in a grand sense, relies on a general idea of people looking at the government for its usefulness and for what the government can do for them in a general sense, although people still do that. But a government that ensures its own survival by design. A government that actively pursues its own survival. And this is a form of artificial intelligence, not to the same degree as people hope for the singularity, that is to say, an artificial intelligence as intelligent as a human being, but rather an artificial intelligence that is composed of a bureaucracy that works to ensure the state's survival. And the reason why I had to build up to this, the reason why I wanted to build this up, is because I think that this is a weird concept. Okay, I'm not saying that this is something that is absurd. I wouldn't say that, but I'm saying that it's weird. It's a way of thinking about government that many people probably have not thought of about government, in the sense that a government naturally, just like a person, a human person has a survival instinct, the government, as the means by which justice is established and maintained in a society, should also have an impulse to preserve itself. And an impulse that is not based on the character of a generation, an impulse that is not based on the ideas of a long-standing tradition, an impulse that is not based on the idea that a culture will compensate for these problems, but an impulse that, from a realistic perspective, naturally has to be rooted in laws, because laws are one thing that can be designed in a way that make certain types of development, certain types of political development difficult, and certain types of political development very punishable. And therefore, through a use of laws, you can excise various types of corruption. You can create mechanisms by which people that commit corruption are held accountable, and by which people are encouraged to hold other people accountable for corruption, and indeed rewarded. In the similar way that the human body operates. The human body, there's the brain, there's the central nervous system, but all of the cells also have their internal chemical processing and their internal genetic code that is then expressed through RNA, and there's stimulus and reaction, and there's also the autonomous nervous system that doesn't have to necessarily rely on the central nervous system for everything. And so the human body is composed of very many cells, and while some things are centrally controlled, some things are not centrally controlled, and it still works. In the sense that a part of the human body can secrete a certain chemical, and various cells have receptors that they receive that, and then in response they secrete a different chemical that leads to a certain reaction to the human body, ideally a solution to what caused that one cell to release that certain chemical in the first place. And in that sense, the government operating as a body, because it's already a corporation, that is to say, it already is a body, but for it to have a will and an impulse to self-survival, in my view, is very important. And I think that a lot of political theorists are too concerned about how can we gain as much representation as possible, how can we ensure that we have as much progress as possible, how can we ensure that our children will have the ability to decide what things our government should do in the future, when instead they should be focusing on how do we ensure that what we have built lasts, and lasts for tomorrow, lasts for the day after tomorrow, lasts for 1,000 years. And the answer to that question is, rather than making the government a blind tool, as for example, as a vehicle that people drive around, and the vehicle might be intended by some people to last for a long time, but other people are irresponsible with the vehicle and will damage the vehicle, and the vehicle will break. Instead, if the government has a will, and a will to survive, a will to prosper, the government can ensure that those within the state that want to destroy the government or that push governmental change in directions that would subvert the stability of a government don't rise to power. And this doesn't have to be authoritarian. This doesn't have to be totalitarian. This doesn't have to be in a way that means that the government controls every part of somebody's life. Just like when government moved from a natural family structure to a more artificial structure, some things were centralized and other things became more decentralized. And we see this development further on, that there are less things that overall the government was involved in, even though there are more things for the government to be involved in the sense that the government is involved in more things, but if you compare that to the proportion of all things that the government is involved in, what you end up having is that it's less, which is interesting. Now, that being said, this isn't universal. Some governments do trend towards totalitarianism, but I would say that early governments were a lot more totalitarian than any of the dictatorships of the 20th century were. That might be a controversial statement, but I think it's a true statement. I don't think that is particularly controversial among historians, that early governments had a very, very strong proportion of control over the lives of its people. So essentially, my point is that a government should have its own will to survive, and that this will is accomplished through a method of laws, and that just in the way that laws cause people to behave in certain ways. And I see this, I've been doing taxes, so I'm a tax professional. I see people, the way in which taxes are organized change the behavior of people. And that's one way that the law changes the behavior of people. And it doesn't have to be that involved. Okay, let me be very clear. Okay, once again, I'm not arguing for totalitarianism. I'm not saying that the government should be doing more things in people's lives. All I'm saying is that on the top level, the government should be self-protecting. The government should be a sapient government, a government that has knowledge of itself and that has a will of itself and that is capable of enforcing that will to ensure its own survival. In a similar way, that if you allow nonviolent resistors to persist in a society, then the laws to which they are resisting cease to be effective, and therefore justice has been subverted, justice has been destroyed. As such, it becomes necessary eventually to use violence against nonviolent resistors. And I understand that that's a controversial opinion, but I do think that if your interest is maintaining the order, the justice of a society, that is what you have to do. Just like in resistance to violent resistors, violent criminals, if you don't do anything about the violent crimes, then eventually they continue to commit those crimes. Because what punishment is there, what consequence is there? They are not being punished. And you might say, well, if they're being punished, why do they keep doing it? Maybe the punishment is not severe enough. And also, of course, another reason why we have government is the fallibility of man. So by creating a government that ceases to be human, in the sense that a government that ceases to be purely actuated by the wills of humans, we create a government that is superhuman. That is not to say that it is extraordinarily human, but rather that in overcoming the humanity of a society, the government also overcomes, in part, the fallibility that humans have. Now, that being said, a government is as fallible as its laws, in the sense, in a similar way that a computer is as fallible as its programming. So, once again, it's very important to be very careful on how to operate this. But I suppose that is a sufficient discussion of this issue. Please tell me what you thought in the comments section below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think I'm going crazy? I don't think I am. I think that I may be expressing a weird idea. However, I think it is an important way to understand government in unusual ways, from different perspectives, in order to better be able to resolve the problems of government. So anyway, thank you all for watching. I've been Anawiltus, and I will be seeing you all next time. Over and out.